So my name's Michelle Gissara. I'm an RMIT Vice-Chancellor's Indigenous Pre-Doctoral Research Fellow, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm a Kadu Diminan Kadu Yagnanan woman. So that's from a little town up in the Northern Territory called Wadeye, which is about 400 kilometres away from Darwin. But I grew up in Adelaide and moved to Melbourne for study. And I studied a Bachelor of Criminology and Psychology back in 2016. RMIT was one of the first unis to have that double degree, and then from there I did my honours in Criminology and Justice, and now I'm at the PhD. Yeah, so my honours project, I was looking at image-based sexual abuse, or what's colloquially known in the news as revenge porn, and just looking at actually how the news do report on that phenomenon. So looking at it from news articles and news segments on the news on TV, and just seeing what kind of narratives that they were forming when they were reporting on the story. Lots of things to do with victim blaming and kind of that narrative around revenge porn rather than image-based abuse. So that term is kind of frowned upon in academia because it doesn't kind of grasp what actually happens to the victim survivors. And when I looked at it, I was also looking at help-seeking resources that they might or may not include in those stories. So I think it's about that kind of social narrative and what people are listening to in mainstream media. How you talk about violence against women in particular is very important because a lot of people base their opinions on what they might read in a newspaper or see on the TV, and especially when it's talking about such a strong topic and having experts that are trying to tell you this is how we should be talking about it and how we should be helping victim survivors, then for them to use terminology that might not be, helpful for those people that have experienced it, it really is important that the terminology used is for victim survivors and not putting them in a negative light. Yeah, so I've been advocating for the use of image-based sexual abuse. So that's the sharing of intimate images or video without the person's consent or threats to do so. Whereas when the media use it, they like to use the term revenge porn instead, maybe for views and clicks if it's on the internet. Whereas it's more important to use image-based sexual abuse. Revenge porn kind of gives that narrative that victims are deserving of what's happened to them. It's revenge from maybe an ex-partner, and the use of the term pornography or porn is in saying that it's has been made for sexual gratification, where it's been someone's intimate images that have been shared without their consent. So I've actually just started my PhD, so I started in February of this year, and I'm looking at image-based sexual abuse again, but in the terms of First Nations communities, particularly focusing on women and LGBTQIA+ persons, and just having their lived experiences be able to inform policy and procedure when it comes to mitigating image-based sexual abuse, and also helping with service provisions for victim survivors. So I think it's important when doing research with First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's important that it's reciprocal, that it's working with them and not about them like previous research has often been. And I'm hoping to do something called participatory action research, which is actually engaging the participants to go through what exactly has been asked, but in a way that is giving something back to them, so that reciprocity. So I have an example. If I'm doing what's called a yarning circle, where we have a whole bunch of participants, we're actually going to be doing some sort of cultural activity. So that might be bush dyeing or weaving or doing the details on a possum skin cloak with the burning, but we're talking about that sensitive topic at the same time. The reason that's good is that you can kind of talk about sensitive topics without actually looking at someone face to face and having that eye contact, which can sometimes be difficult in Indigenous communities. But also from that, making of cultural artifacts, that's something that can then be used later depending on what the community actually wants from it. Maybe to have an exhibition and showcase that artwork, get money back into the community, or just something to hold on to for themselves for their own cultural healing. Yeah, so yarning as a methodology is an Indigenous methodology that is kind of highlighting the knowledge that people hold and also the stories that people share. So having that yarning circle is a safe space where people can talk about certain topics, which is why I think it's good for image-based abuse, because it is such a kind of tough topic for people to talk about, but knowing that the inner circle of people that have experienced it as well, they can kind of let their guard down and talk about those tough topics, and from that be able to influence policy and procedure, like I said before. But what I want to get from people is how they've experienced it, if they have then reported, what the differences are between reporting to mainstream services and Indigenous-led services, just so from that the cultural engagement of those people when they report is like fostered properly, I guess. So it's still early days, so we're still tossing up with my supervisors whether to do it just focused in Victoria or to do it on a national level. But through Victoria, just going through places like the VATCHOs, so the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations, Gissara, which work with people that are going through domestic and family violence, so women and children. So Indigenous-led services, to go through them and recruit participants via their services. And then that kind of snowball effect where then they might recommend another place that could be useful, such as gathering places in Victoria as well, where Aboriginal people come and connect together. Yeah, so qualitative data, so more about the stories and experiences that people have gone through, and from those stories, what from that can actually help organisations better support victim survivors, and also just get a bit more information about people's experiences, because at the moment it's really statistic based. So like 1 in 5 non-Indigenous people have experienced image-based sexual abuse, or IPSA for short, and it's 1 in 2 Indigenous people that have experienced it. So we know that it is more prevalent in Indigenous communities, but we don't actually know the stories behind it, because that's where the gap in the research is. Yeah, I think that history of colonisation, and especially around the stolen generation, it's people having that wariness of reporting to certain services, especially government-based services or the police, for instance. And so there's that real kind of trepidation about reporting and what's going to happen to that person when they report, which I'm hoping to uncover in my research. What are those barriers to reporting, and how we can help, women and LGBTQIA+ people better be able to advocate for themselves and go, be assisted through their journey. Yeah, so social and emotional well-being from an Indigenous perspective is looking at the way that an individual or within their community is connected to different things that I guess non-Indigenous people don't really think about. So that kind of connection to their community, kinship connections to the country and the land, and connections to culture and that kind of stuff that really kind of forms an individual's sense of well-being that might not necessarily be from that regular non-Indigenous psychological perspective. I actually do a bit of work with the Black Dog Institute, so I'm one of their national network members that have that lived experience of suicide and ill mental health, and the big focus is on social and emotional well-being, because how you might relate to me and assist me going through a mental health issue or episode might be different to how you would for a non-Indigenous person when they don't have those same relational aspects to, community, kinship, land, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so hoping to highlight Black stories of kind of victim survivors and, what they want to see happen from this research that can help facilitate reporting of image-based sexual abuse, maybe more than it is being done now, working through those barriers that people might be having when they come to report for both mainstream and Indigenous-led services, and just be able to kind of give those stories a voice, maybe if it's through the art that comes from the participatory action research, or if it's just more stories that can be fed through to those service provisions that can help connect better, I guess. Yeah, when it comes to Indigenous people, they are more likely to experience image-based abuse, but it might be non-Indigenous people that feel like they have more access to resources or systems of support. So just trying to bridge that gap. I think it's having Indigenous scholars leading that Indigenous research, you know, in history, it's been a lot of white researchers that have kind of inserted themselves into Aboriginal communities and wondering what they can gain from their research to help them along their way, rather than Indigenous people that are part of that community that want to help the people of that community and give something back. So that reciprocity, like I said before, is important. Yeah. Yeah, I think the main cultural safety aspect is making sure that there are Indigenous researchers as part of Indigenous research. Sometimes the reason why projects may crumble or fall apart is because there's people there that don't have that experience that you have from being an Aboriginal person, being within the community, and knowing that the research is important many, many years after as well, that you're, you know, respectful of the people that you're researching, that you do have that genuine reciprocity, and that it is about using those Indigenous knowledges, the yarning methodologies, and everything that your knowledge is based around is embedded in that Indigenous knowledge, knowing, being and doing. And I think sometimes if there's researchers that you're working with that are non-Indigenous, as long as they have that cultural safety and awareness and understanding of how research can be done, it's not exactly linear. Sometimes research can take a little bit longer when you're working with Indigenous people, but that's part and parcel of it. So just the people that you're working with having that cultural knowledge and understanding really goes a long way in respectful, culturally safe research. Yeah, I'm really excited to be at RMIT, or back at RMIT, doing this Vice-Chancellor's Indigenous Predoctoral Research Fellowship, which is such a mouthful, but it's just so important because it gives that kind of avenue for Indigenous scholars or potential scholars to able to have that kind of service of people wrapping around you. There's lots of other people that are on different pathways of their fellowships, so some of them might just be finishing up their PhD now, and some like me are just starting, but we have a really good network, and especially through Negara Willem, which is the Indigenous kind of centre at RMIT, it's like a home away from home. There's always support and kind of safety with the people that are there, and it's just like a highlight of coming to RMIT and being engaged in the community.